about small-scale fisheries and why they're so important for our economies and our rural communities. On our FFAW panel, we have Keith Sullivan, who is the president of FFAW. We have Dr. Aaron Carruthers, who is our fisheries scientist, and we have Dwan Street, who is moving from project coordinator into staff representative role. So thank you all for being here. We're going to start with Keith, who's going to talk to us about fisheries and economic recovery.
Yep, thank you, Elise. And I should say, first of all, it's a happy World Fisheries Day, but it is definitely a time for us to reflect on the value of our fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, it's the reason that most of our communities exist as they are, and really, it's so intertwined with our culture in so many ways. But the part that's often not emphasized enough is the economic value and the prosperity that it brings to our communities and our province as a whole. And this was really evident in a year amid the pandemic. 2020 has been a tough, challenging year for just about everybody. And that includes those who work in the fishery, but it was still very valuable. People worked continually throughout the year, and the fishery is still very, very valuable. And I mean, that just talks to how resilient it is. And really, in a year where other sectors, we think of tourism and everything, for example, suffered so much, that it was evident, so clear, that the value of fisheries in our coastal communities, which most would fall in the smaller scale fisheries that we're talking about as a theme this year. So, it's also a time to kind of think about the value that we have in our fisheries and celebrate that and the people who work so hard to make it happen, but also really seriously consider how we improve them, make them more valuable for people. And, we hear comments certainly all the time around from whether it's a politician or just people in our communities. We really need to have this value go back to our communities. Independent owner operator inshore fisheries are the lifeblood of our communities, but we've got to put those words into action continually, and that really don't happen enough. So on a federal scene, the new catchphrase that's mentioned in the speech from the throne was the blue economy. And that's not really well defined, but we're encouraged to hear that our government want that to start with inshore harvesters and people in our coastal communities. So that's a must. Again, we need that to be put into action. That's the main thing. So really, how do we do that? And we're glad now that we have a focus on economic recovery. Dame Green in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador is chairing a team that is looking at economic recovery, as they call it. And obviously we have incredible opportunities in the fishery. So we got to look at the tangible things. What do we do? So over the last number of years, we've seen fishing companies go outside policies, take over inshore harvesters. These, what they call a green, soon be legal. But so far, we haven't seen enough emphasis on stopping that. I mean, we've seen companies moving in, taking over inshore licenses, having money leave our coastal communities, and not enough been done with it. That's something that's really got to happen. We need to see more of the adjacent species off our shore, whether that's a traditional species we harvested, or whether it's in an emerging fishery, go to the local inshore harvesters, what we call the owner-operator harvesters. So that has to happen more. And we got to continue to invest in, whether it's the infrastructure, whether it's continuing to promote quality and ensure that we have the good product that the market wants. We do it very well. We already have the most professional, best trained fisheries workers, whether that's on the harvesting or processing side. So we're very well positioned to take advantage of the growth that we're seeing overall in the value of wild fish. I mean, we have, you know, well managed resources, we have professionals, and, you know, we can deliver top quality wild seafood to the world. We'll continue to do that. So there's a number of things we got to do to make sure that we're able to grow the value, make sure that we continue to do more of that value added work in our communities and not ship that value and jobs outside of our province and country. So I think it can be complicated, but we got to look at those basics, you know, giving the fish to inshore harvesters, making sure they control uh, making sure they control those value licenses, making sure that we give people the support we need to be successful, and then add as much value as we can right here. So there's some of the message I would say that I want our governments to hear. Chair of an economic recovery team, for example, really look at those very closely at a time while we're celebrating World Fisheries Day, celebrating the people that make it all happen. And a good way to celebrate is with a delicious feed, a local seafood. So thanks very much. It's good to be able to talk to people on a day like this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keith. It's certainly good to hear about the resiliency of our fisheries, and I think that we'll definitely touch on that once we hear from Aaron and Dwan. Dr. Aaron Crothers is next on our panel. I'll hand it over to you, Aaron. Aaron, you're on mute. Technology.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks, Elise. When we're talking about fisheries science and small-scale fisheries and owner-operator fleets, I think the way I'm going to talk about that and talk about why it's important to have harvesters at the table, both doing the work but also helping to form the questions. I'm going to use the example of what we're doing in the Gulf with respect to the new Unit 1 redfish fishery and also to the ongoing line trawl halibut fishery. Because what we're trying to do in the Gulf is we're trying to build a sustainable redfish fishery in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Right now, there is unprecedented levels of recruitment of redfish in the Gulf, and we haven't had a redfish fishery in the Gulf, a fully commercial redfish fishery in the Gulf since the 1990s. But I also want to put it in perspective for why this matters for coastal communities. Back in the 1980s, when we did have a redfish fishery and we did have landing on shore, that fishery was supporting 5 months of onshore processing work. So it's not just about that fleet, the redfish fleet, but it's also about those onshore jobs and that support for coastal communities. So with redfish, we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a sustainable fishery. And the thing about redfish is they're long-lived. So if we do this right, we might be able to develop a fishery that supports communities for decades. So this is a big opportunity, and we're throwing a lot of effort at it. So when we're developing this fishery, we're thinking about the mobile fleet in 4R3PN or at the Gulf fishery. We're thinking about those onshore communities that are going to be able to support, that are going to be supported by the redfish fishery. But we're also thinking about, when we're designing this program, we're thinking about those other fisheries that are going to be impacted. So, for example, the halibut line trawl fishery is an important fishery for many small boat harvesters in 4R3PN. And we know that there is overlap between where these halibut go to spawn in the winter and where the redfish fishery has been historically. So how do you develop a redfish fishery that doesn't harm existing sustainable fisheries? And that's really what our questions are coming at. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the questions that we're trying to solve in this experimental fishery in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or what we call Unit 1 redfish. So that's a bit of background, but what we're doing here is we're doing a number of experiments. One of our experiments is you take two bottom trawls, you put them beside each other, and you make one of them experimental, and you see if there are ways that you can continue to catch redfish commercially, but also avoid catching other species. like Atlantic halibut, like Atlantic cod. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. We're doing it where you see if you can have separator panels and force those unwanted bycatch back out through the bottom of the trawl and back out again so that they are not caught and they're not brought to the surface and harmed. That's one way. Another way is to move your trawl off the bottom and again, get those unwanted bycatch out underneath and release them at depth instead of capturing them. So that's another way that we're trying. And a third way is by using midwater trawls, just taking the trawl right off the bottom and seeing if we can catch redfish and avoid halibut. And so we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and we've got some really encouraging early results. You know, we find that halibut do go down and out through the bottom of the trawl, but we also are not catching quite as much redfish. So in this next phase, what we're trying to do is really refine it so that we can have a commercial redfish fishery that does not negatively impact these other high value sustainable fisheries that support many, many small boats throughout 4R 3PN. So it's a really wonderful opportunity that we've been working on now for a couple of years. And I think we're getting closer each time. I'd also like to point out that when we do things like when we fish with a midwater trawl, it took a couple of years for the fish to bunch up and for us to figure out how to catch them with midwater. But you can catch redfish with midwater and not catch any of those halibuts. The question is, what is the best way and what are the many different options that we can develop for fishing a redfish fishery without negatively impacting other fisheries? And I think FFAW is in a really unique position to be building a redfish fishery in the Gulf, in that we have members onshore who, of course, want to have a sustainable long-term fishery. We also have members in the mobile fleet who are really wanting to have a sustainable redfish fishery, and we're also representing those small boat halibut and other groundfish harvesters who want to see this fishery grow, but also not have negative impacts on theirs. So I'm really thrilled about all of the comments and engagement that we have had with harvesters over the course of the last couple of years with this fishery. And we wouldn't have asked the questions that we are in the ways that we are if we didn't have real engagement from the harvesters who are working on this project and also the harvesters who are watching the development of this project. So it's been really exciting. And one of the new things that we'll be doing in 2021 is not only are we trying to avoid halibut and figure out ways to release them during the capture process, but we're also going to be tagging them to look at post-release survival or not in the redfish trawl. So these are really, really important questions. And I don't think that we would be asking the questions the way that we are without harvesters at the table designing the experiments with us. I have learned an awful lot from the trawl captains that we've been working with over the past 2 years on this question.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that insight. And I think that a lot of times we get a lot of discouraging news, but this is certainly an area that we see a lot of opportunity, especially for our members that are offshore and onshore. So we look forward to seeing what comes next. Speaking of coming next, Dwan Street's going to talk about ghost gear.
Good morning. Thanks, Elise, for the opportunity to talk about this important project. It's a new one for us. It's a big one, and of course, a very valuable one for our members. There's been a focus in the past few years of cleaning up our oceans, and of course, plastics don't degrade and are a huge concern in our waters. We've all seen the pictures, of course, of seabirds, whales, fish entangled in plastics, and it's very concerning. The statistic that DFO always uses with regards to ghost gear is that there's an estimate that ghost gear could take up about 46 to 70% of macroplastics in our oceans by weight. And of course, for us and our members, that's a huge concern. So when the federal government released their Sustainable Fishery Solutions and Retrieval Support Contribution Program, or to cut it down, the Ghost Gear Fund, last year, we saw a great opportunity to apply for some funding and retrieve some ghost gear around our province. Our members have been bringing concerns to us for years, and of course, some loss of gear is inevitable, and that's completely out of the hands of our members. You know, we have ice conditions, ropes fail, and our members do try to retrieve that gear, but sometimes we do need mechanisms that are a little bit more heavy duty. So when we did become a part of the group of 26 initiatives across Canada to receive funding for this project, which is, by the way, a 2-year initiative, we contacted our colleagues in Funding North, who have been doing similar work since 2008, and just kind of picked their brains on what worked and what didn't. So the gear that we developed and was manufactured by our members in our industrial unit of Steel Fab Industries was modeled after what Funding North is using after many years of trial and error to find what is most efficient in retrieving gear. This piece of gear is quite heavy duty. It's a 10-foot bar. It's got 5 massive anchors hanging from it, and that tows along the bottom. So we interviewed a lot of our members in certain areas to determine areas that they thought would be problematic where ghost gear was known to be. And accompanying this, we partnered with Marine Institute's Kirk Regular. He's a marine geomatic specialist, to use a side scan sonar. And what we do is one vessel will go out the day before, use the sonar on these areas to see if we can identify gear on the bottom. And then the following day, the retrieval vessel, armed with that huge grapple, will go out and try to retrieve what we see. We also would send the sonar out then into just other areas that are known to be areas of lost gear, and they would continue their work ahead of the retrieval vessel. So to date, we started in Bay St. George, and Bay St. George was a really good bay to start out in and get used to using the gear and everything, because harvesters had said, you know, they had done a really good job with harvester-led initiatives and community-based initiatives in keeping the bay pretty pristine. And it was one thing that I noticed as we were steaming along. You know, you look on the beach and there's hardly a scrap of driftwood. It's a beautiful area. Have definitely done a wonderful job there. But we did retrieve some gear. We were able to release 10 happy lobsters back into the water and bring in a lobster pot and return it to its owner. There was some halibut gear, some lost buoys, and some other debris such as tires, a piece of a plane wing. Given the American base that used to be there, we weren't really surprised. We moved to Placentia Bay, and speaking of American bases, of course, everyone knows that there was a significant presence in Argentia. Now, they have since moved out since the mid-90s, and we ran into some very interesting areas down there when trying to retrieve gear. And, you know, we saw remnants of the old base. We did retrieve some inactive cable and some other debris as well. But of course, this was one of the areas that we did have a few lessons learned, because with the bottom type and the amount of debris on the bottom, we weren't as successful as we'd hoped to be. So that is something we can bring forward as well to the government to say, you know, there are significant remnants of the base's presence in Argentia, and maybe this is something we can look at for a cleanup as we go forward. We are moving now into Harbour Breton, and we have had amazing success in Harbour Breton. We're only in day 2, but on day 1, we were able to remove 21 lobster pots. And that included a significant number of live lobsters that were in those pots that have been returned to the water. So that's great news. Those pots are currently in the process of being returned to their owners. And reports from this morning also say that there are more pots coming up today. So tomorrow will be the final day of retrieval in Harbour Breton, but we are really, really looking forward to the results and being able to do our little part in keeping our fishing areas clean and free of ghost gear. Because of course, harvesters are the greatest steward of the resource, and they have been very concerned for quite some time. So we're very thankful for the federal government releasing this funding and allowing us to do this very important work. And at the same time, I, of course, want to send a huge bouquet to the harvesters that we have been working with in Bay St. George, Captains Rennie and Chad Hickey and their crews. in Placentia Bay, Captains Gary Mulrooney and Brian Corrine Jr. and their crews, and now in Harbour Breton, Captains Wesley Snook and Randall Snook and their crews. It's great to see our members so involved, and I will say when we put out a call for applications for these projects, the amount of response we got was overwhelming, and that informed our members and how much they just care about their marine ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dwan. It's certainly great to hear so many of our members that are involved in the stewardship, and I think that was a great point, that it is our membership that is the most dedicated to marine stewardship. So now we're just going to go around to questions. I'm going to start with President Keith Sullivan. Keith, you mentioned about owner-operator. What do you think in terms of economic policy and going forward to protecting our inshore fishery? What policies are going to be the most important that we as a membership make sure are like front of mind anytime that we're going out and talking to, all levels of government, really? You are on mute.
There is a couple of things happening right now regarding the on the federal front. So we just had a new Fisheries Act that talk about promoting, protecting inshore owner-operator harvesters. So that's very important that the government recognizes how important these harvesters are to the coastal economy. So that was a step one. Now we're having regulations that will actually make those agreements where companies can own inshore harvesters, make sure they are illegal. So really bringing these under regulation and into law, then you got to enforce that. You really have to enforce those rules, because I think I may have said it before. I mean, having these large processing companies be able to buy up all of the inshore licenses from our outports and coastal communities is really preventing the next generations from harvester from getting in. They're really putting a block on the development of our future fisheries and our communities. So that's one. The other one is, obviously priority access for people in these fleets. I mean, the reason people have settled here, they've always harvested what's adjacent to them, whatever species is there. Obviously, in many areas, cod throughout our history has been, really prevalent, but other species as well. And as different ebbs and flows in the environment make it conducive for other species, I mean, these same people got to get access to these resources. And, that's some of the consideration that we really got to work with, and not, just find ways to move those people out of the fishery. You got to bring them in, make sure that our communities remain vibrant. And I think those are two really fundamental things we focus on when we talk about stronger communities, better jobs for people on land, and just really building up a strong, robust economy based on just what's off our shores and off our headlands there. So there's great opportunities. We got all the tools to do it. We do need supports from government in the way of policy and just good, sound, sensible decisions.
Awesome. Speaking of opportunities and maybe ways that we're looking to the future and looking for ways to do things differently and new areas that we can certainly research. Dr. Erin Carruthers, I'm going to invite you back on for a question.
Okay.
Unmuted. Perfect. We love that. So, Erin, you talked a lot about harvesters having a seat at the table. What do you think the most, important thing is for harvesters who want to get a seat at the table, who want to get more involved in kind of this science side? What can we tell them about how they can become more involved, or kind of advocates out in their communities? So,
when we talk about harvesters' involvement in science and management, or in new science projects, there are multiple ways that you can be involved, and that it's really important to have harvesters at the table. So it's the types of questions that we're looking at, those are brought up by our members. Those are highlighted by our members. When when we talk about the questions that I'm currently spending time on with redfish and halibut, those are brought forward by harvesters in the 3PN fleets or in the 4R fleets, but also, so they bring those forward. That's one way, you bring the questions forward. Another way is active involvement in those projects, in those research projects. So all of our projects that we do are, we make sure that everybody who is related to that particular project, like it's on a particular fishery or in a particular area. So everybody who meets the criteria, like whatever equipment you need for that project, has an equal opportunity to participate in that project. So we do charters for a lot of our surveys. And so we'll do a call out to everybody who is able to do that work and in that area. So people are involved in getting the work done. That's a big one. You know what's an often overlooked part of this is harvesters' involvement in refining a question or making the research better. Science at its best should be iterative. You come back to the same question and it should be cumulative. You should be getting better. You should be doing more refined questions. You should be leaving aside questions that don't that are no longer useful, and you should be building on the knowledge of people who have been doing the work before you, and importantly in fisheries, you should be building on the knowledge of people who are out there on the water, seeing the fish and seeing those changes. So I think an often overlooked component of harvesters being at the table is their ability to refine the types of questions and to challenge us about doing a better job focusing in on what needs to be done and how we're doing that. So this happens on all our projects. So number one, asking questions. Number two, being part of the projects. Number three, evaluating those projects and refining it and helping with making the project design better. Those are all important ways of being at the table. And another way of being at the table is also being at the assessment table. So in Canada, we have, and for our fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have annual or every few year annual assessments of the different stocks. And I think it's also important to have harvesters at the table looking at those data and looking at what's being brought forward and reflecting on how that relates against their own knowledge in the fishery. So that's being at the assessment table is another important aspect of harvesters being at the table. And it also is part of those discussions that we have with our when we have fleet meetings, when we have advisory meetings. All of those components are important places for getting involved in science, thinking seriously about what science is doing and how that relates to harvesters' experience and what they're seeing on the water, and also asking the type of questions that really matter for harvesters and for their fishery. So there's many different ways and many important steps for how harvesters can be involved in fishery science.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin. I think it's always important for our members to remember that, they are the union. We are all the union, and we're all doing this work together. And any time that they can become involved, it really helps out the long-term work that we're doing. Speaking of long-term work, Dwan Street, I'm going to invite you back on to talk a little bit more about kind of Go Skier and you think the long-term impact that these sort of projects have on our rural communities and rural sustainability with the inshore fishery.
Absolutely. As I've said before, harvesters are the greatest steward of the resource. And a harvester once said something to me that stuck with me on the importance of harvester-led initiatives and said, if you take care of the fish will take care of you. And I think that's at the core of every harvester who fishes on our waters. And we've seen harvesters' involvement in a lot of sustainability initiatives, just proving how much they care about our marine ecosystem. We saw the harvester-led initiative for the Eastport MPA to protect lobsters. Harvesters were leaders in using biodegradable twine in crab and lobster pots, escape hatches. What Erin mentioned earlier with the separation grates on trawls, harvesters want to come up with this technology and make sure they're doing the least amount of harm to our oceans as they're fishing the resource. So Go Skier has always been a huge concern, and as long as I've been around the table, I've heard it. Losing gear is, yes, a part of fishing, but always something that harvesters are concerned about, speak about, and have been looking for years for some funding to try and go out and retrieve some of this. So this funding is very important, and we're hoping that the program will continue. Next year, we'll be moving into the Northeast Coast and 2J3KL. Of course, very heavy snow crab areas, a lot of ice conditions that take some pots, and harvesters really can't do anything about that. They do what they can, but Mother Nature takes over sometimes. So we're definitely looking forward to doing some work in those areas. When it comes to long term, knowing that that gear is no longer on the bottom and goes fishing, as I said, when we retrieved lobster pots in both Bay St. George and in Harbor Breton, we're able to release live lobsters back into the environment. And that's always a good news story. It's always great to see, because of course that resource then will go on to spawn and reproduce and provide value to our coastal communities for years to come. And we're hoping that we can continue this work, keep removing gear from the bottom of our oceans, and also keep working with our members on other ways that we can improve gear types and on other sustainability initiatives. I want to say thank you again to our members for all the hard work that they do put in on these initiatives and making sure that the marine environment that they rely on is kept pristine and as healthy as we can. Because as we go forward, of course, Keith spoke about the economic climate in our province and how important it is right now that the value of our fishery be recognized, because it is a significant economic driver, especially in all of our rural coastal communities. And that both goes for those on the water and on land, and on the hundreds of spin-off jobs that come from the fishery. So yeah, this work is important. It is going to be a long-term commitment for our union, and we look forward to continuing this very important work for our members.
Awesome. So that's it for everybody. I'd certainly like to thank all of our speakers today. And this has been a really tough year. I think we've heard that once, twice, 1,000 times. But we have been really proud about what we've been able to do for our membership, and what we will continue to do for our membership going forward into 2021, which is hopefully an even better year for the inshore fisheries. So have a happy World Fisheries Day. Thank you for watching.